Story 1. This happened when I was a kid, around 8 years old. My parents had me later in life, and my older siblings were much older than me, at least a decade. One night, I woke up to a lot of noise coming from downstairs. It was my parents, and they seemed upset about something. I cracked my bedroom door open and could hear them talking in hushed but frantic voices. I could not make out what they were saying, so I tiptoed to the top of the stairs and called out, "Mom? Dad?" My mom came to the bottom of the stairs, looking tense. She said, "Go back to bed." Her tone told me not to argue, so I listened and went back to my room. Even though I was curious and a bit worried, I managed to lie back down. Not long after, I heard the front door slam shut. Then, everything went silent. I figured they must have left the house, but I had no idea why. I tried to push the thought away and fall asleep again. A little later, I woke up to more noises from downstairs. This time, it was the sound of the front door closing, followed by quiet footsteps. There was no talking, so I assumed my parents were back and trying not to wake me. I stayed in bed, listening to occasional thuds, the sound of cabinets opening and closing, and what I thought was the fridge being opened. At the time, I thought it was my older brother, Josh. He was a teenager then and had started driving, so it was not unusual for him to come home late and raid the kitchen. I told myself it had to be him. It made sense, and it helped me stay calm. But then, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs. They were steady and slow, getting closer and louder until they stopped right outside my door. The door creaked open, just enough for me to see a dark shape standing there. I stayed lying down, my eyes wide open. It was too dark to see clearly, but the silhouette looked like a head peeking into the room. I whispered, "Josh? Mom? Dad?" When no one answered, I asked, "Who is it?" Still, there was no reply. After a few moments, the figure closed the door. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to brush it off. Maybe it was my dad checking on me, I thought. Still, I could not figure out why he would ignore me. I heard the footsteps go back downstairs, and after a while, everything was quiet again. My curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to check things out. I got out of bed and tiptoed downstairs, leaving the lights off so I would not disturb anyone. When I reached the kitchen, I froze in the doorway. There, standing in the middle of the room, was a tall figure. The person was facing away from me, and I could not see any details in the dark. My heart was pounding, but I managed to say, "Dad?" The figure turned slightly, and in a deep voice, said, "Go back upstairs." That voice, it was not my dad. Panic set in, and I bolted back upstairs as fast as I could, slamming my bedroom door shut behind me. I jumped into bed, pulling the covers over my head, my mind racing. Why did my dad's voice sound so strange? I tried to convince myself it was him, but deep down, I started to realize something was very wrong. It did not fully click until I heard the front door open again and the familiar sound of my parents' voices. They were back. I got up and went to the top of the stairs. My parents looked startled to see me awake. I asked them what was going on, and they told me that my brother Josh had been in a minor accident. They had rushed to the hospital when they got the call, leaving me asleep at home. Later, I found out that Josh had been driving when he should not have been and had ended up in a crash. Luckily, he was okay. At the time, I asked my dad if he had come into my room earlier. That was when I learned that they had been gone for hours. My mom's face went pale, and she turned to my dad, yelling that he had forgotten to lock the door when they left. When I told them about the person at my door and in the kitchen, my dad immediately grabbed his gun and searched the house, while my mom called the police. A police officer came and asked me to explain everything I had seen and heard. The details of what happened next are blurry to me now, but I remember my parents telling the police about how they had left the house unlocked in their rush to get to the hospital. They said they felt foolish explaining it, but the reality was terrifying. We never did find out who was in the house that night, and it still gives me chills to think about it. They left me alone and forgot to lock the door. Looking back, I do not think anything valuable was taken. But the thought of someone breaking into our home, walking around while I was upstairs, is something that still sends shivers down my spine. Whoever it was did not seem to have any intention of hurting me, and for that, I am grateful. Still, the idea of a complete stranger inside our house, moving around like they belonged there, is chilling enough. Now imagine experiencing all of that as an 8-year-old kid. At that age, you do not fully understand the dangers of the world. But after that night, I started to. The house, which had always felt safe and familiar, no longer felt like a fortress. Instead, it felt like it had cracks, openings that someone could slip through, unnoticed. Even now, as an adult, the memory of that night stays with me. It was not just the fear of the unknown but also the realization of how vulnerable we all are, even in our own homes. Story 2. It must have been around 2013 or 2014. My younger brother, Ethan, was about 7 or 8 at the time. We had just moved into a new house closer to his school because the rent was more affordable. The house was nice, all things considered, and even had a cozy fireplace that made winters feel extra warm. Ethan was obsessed with Batman back then, and his favorite toy was this flashy Batman car. It lit up and made sounds whenever you pressed a button. He played with it constantly. One afternoon, Ethan came running inside after playing in the backyard, holding something in his hands. He looked so excited that my mom and I could not help but ask what he had found. He handed us an old photo of a young boy. It looked like one of those school picture tags you get when parents splurge on the photo package. The picture was dirty and worn out, so much so that you could not even see what year it was taken. We assumed it was just some random photo someone had dropped and thought nothing of it. Then Ethan said something strange. "That is Buddy," he announced. I frowned, not sure what he meant. "Buddy?" I asked. He nodded and pointed at the boy in the picture. "Yeah, he is my friend." The way he said it was so casual, like I should know who Buddy was. This confused me because Ethan was shy and did not make friends easily, especially since we had just moved here. I figured he had probably met some kid nearby and somehow ended up with this school photo. I shrugged it off. That night, I woke up around 3 in the morning to hear Ethan talking. It was muffled, but it was clear he was having a full-on conversation. Annoyed, I got up and went to his room to tell him to go back to sleep before he woke up our parents. When I opened his door, I found him sitting up straight in bed, talking to, well, nothing. There was no one else in the room. "Ethan, go to bed," I said, feeling a bit creeped out. He looked at me, nodded, and laid back down. I went back to my room, trying not to think too much about it. A couple of days later, my mom brought up Ethan's behavior. She asked me if I had noticed anything strange, like him waking up at odd hours. I told her about the night I heard him talking. She said he had been acting odd lately, but we both brushed it off as typical kid stuff. My bedroom was right across from the hallway, and if I turned over in bed, I could see the light from the hallway. I hated the dark, so I always left the light on, knowing Dad would turn it off once he got up. One night, I was lying in bed when I heard a sound that made my heart race. It was Ethan's Batman car. The thing was going off, flashing lights and making noises. I got up, annoyed, and went to his room to tell him to knock it off. But when I walked in, Ethan was sound asleep. The car was on the floor, on the other side of the room, still making its noises. I picked it up, turned it off, and went back to bed. Over the next few days, Ethan would not stop talking about Buddy. It was starting to make me uneasy. I decided to check with the neighbors, thinking maybe Buddy was some kid Ethan had met. The house to our left had no kids, and the house to our right was vacant. This just made things even stranger. When I told Dad, he brushed it off, saying Buddy was probably just an imaginary friend Ethan had made up. Even so, weird things kept happening. Almost every night, someone, either Mom, Dad, or me, would hear that Batman car going off in Ethan's room. It was happening so often that my sister, Emily, started sleeping in my room because it freaked her out too. Dad kept insisting the toy must have been motion activated, but I knew better. When we bought it, there was no mention of that feature. Still, I tried to rationalize it and convince myself it was nothing. But deep down, I was starting to feel like something was not quite right. One night, my sister Emily and I were in my room, trying to shake off a bad dream. We kept each other company, whispering back and forth, doing our best to stay calm. The house was quiet except for the sound of our voices, until we heard it. That dreaded noise. Ethan's Batman car started going off again. Emily and I froze, our eyes darting toward the open door. Ethan's room was directly across from mine, and we could see into the hallway. Then, our expressions turned to pure terror. The Batman car rolled past the doorway on its own. We screamed at the top of our lungs and bolted to our parents' room. They were startled awake, confused and annoyed. When we told them what had happened, they were convinced Ethan was playing a mean trick on us. My dad marched into Ethan's room, ready to scold him. But Ethan was wide awake, sitting up in bed with a serious expression. What he said next made my skin crawl. "It wasn't me," Ethan said in a small voice. "Buddy wanted to play. That was it for the Batman car." My dad took it out to the trash, removing the batteries first to make sure it would not cause any more trouble. Emily and I finally felt some relief, thinking it was over. But the next day, Ethan had the toy again. When my parents saw it, they were furious. "Ethan," my mom said, "we told you to leave that in the trash. Did you dig it out?" Ethan shook his head, looking as innocent as ever. "No," he replied. "Buddy got it for me." This time, my dad smashed the toy into pieces and threw it away for good. Ethan was upset, of course, but my parents bought him a new Batman action figure to make up for it. For a while, it seemed like things were finally normal again. A week passed, and we all started to feel like maybe Buddy had moved on, or maybe he never existed at all, and we were just overthinking everything. Then something else happened. One evening, my mom was in the kitchen cooking dinner. She was making chicken breasts on her George Foreman grill, which she had set up on the countertop. At some point, she stepped into the living room to ask my dad a question. That was when we all heard it, a loud crash from the kitchen. We jumped up and ran to see what had happened. The George Foreman grill was halfway across the kitchen floor. My mom stood there, stunned. "I swear it was nowhere near the edge," she said, her voice shaky. My dad inspected the counter and the grill but had no explanation. It was not like it had slid off, it looked like someone had picked it up and tossed it. After that incident, nothing else happened. Whatever, or whoever, Buddy was, he seemed to stop making himself known. We moved out about a year later, and life went back to normal. But even now, I cannot help but wonder. Was Buddy really just a figment of Ethan's imagination? Or was there more to his friend than any of us wanted to admit? Story 3. When I was just 10 years old, my family moved to a new town. It was a big change, and starting at a new elementary school in 5th grade was no picnic. I walked into a place where everyone already seemed to know each other, and I was just this random outsider trying to find my place. At my new school, the rule was to sit with your classmates during lunch. I remember those first few days being painfully awkward. At that age, kids can be brutally judgmental, and being the new kid did not make making friends any easier. Despite the rough start, those early days in the neighborhood led me to meet a few kids nearby. One of the first kids I met was Jake. Jake went to a private school, so we were not in the same classes, but we bumped into each other while I was biking down the street. He came right up to me and asked, "Hey, are you the one who just moved into the house on the corner?" That started our friendship. We would hang out sometimes, but only after school and on weekends since we were at different schools. A few days later, I met another kid, Ethan. Ethan was not shy at all. One afternoon, he actually rang my doorbell and asked my parents if I could come out and meet him. When my parents called me to the door, I was a little confused. Ethan introduced himself and said he lived just down the block. Then he asked me the most important question any kid could ask: "Do you like video games?" Of course, I said yes. He immediately invited me over to his house to play Grand Theft Auto, San Andreas. I did not own the game but had wanted it for a long time, so naturally, I agreed. We walked to his house, which was on the opposite end of the block. The moment I saw his place, I noticed it stood out, but not in a good way. It was about the same size as the other houses on the street, but it looked run down, like no one had taken care of it for years. Instead of grass in the front yard, there were two big patches of dirt with a cracked walkway cutting through them. Inside, things were not any better. The house was cluttered with random boxes and junk in every room. It looked like the home of a hoarder. Ethan led me down to the basement, and I immediately noticed a weird smell, like a dozen cats had been living down there. Oddly, there were no pets in sight. The basement was the messiest part of the house. Stuff was piled everywhere, and the air felt damp and stale. He pointed to a beat-up brown leather couch sitting in front of an old television. That was our spot. He had a GameCube and a PlayStation 2 hooked up, and he fired up San Andreas. We played the two-player mode, and honestly, it was a lot of fun. For a moment, I thought I might really enjoy hanging out with Ethan and that we could become friends. After a couple of hours, I decided it was time to go home. I told him, "Hey, I have to head out." Ethan looked disappointed, like he wanted me to stay longer, but I had already been there for a while and just wanted to leave. He ended up walking with me halfway back to my house, which felt a little strange. I finally said something like, "All right, see you later," which was my polite way of saying, "Okay, go home now." Looking back, that was the first time I thought Ethan might be a little odd, but I did not think much of it at the time. The next day, Ethan rang our doorbell again. He asked my parents if I could come out to play. This time, we stayed at my house and played on my GameCube in my room. While we were hanging out, I started feeling uneasy. He had this way of standing or sitting too close, and it made me uncomfortable. He did not seem to understand personal space. By the time he left, I was already beginning to feel like something about him was just off. The day after that, Ethan showed up at my door again after school. I was not in the mood to hang out, so I told my mom to tell him I was not feeling well. He left, but I could tell he was disappointed. Later that afternoon, I biked over to Jake's house to see if he wanted to hang out. He was up for it, so we grabbed our bikes and rode up the block. That turned out to be a bad idea because as we passed Ethan's house, he came outside. It was almost like he had been watching the street from his window. It was awkward, especially since my mom had just told him I was sick. As we rode past, I whispered to Jake, "That is the kid I hung out with. He is a little strange." Jake looked surprised. "You hung out with Ethan?" he asked. "That whole family is weird." He then told me that Ethan was actually 12 years old, a couple of years older than me. From that point on, I decided to avoid Ethan as much as possible. The following weekend, Ethan showed up at our door again, asking for me. I had already told my mom to say I was not home if he came back, and that is exactly what she did. That night, something woke me up out of a dead sleep. The first thing I noticed was that my window was wide open, and a chilly breeze was blowing into my room. It was late September, and the nights were already getting cold. I knew for a fact I had closed the window before going to bed. Groggy and confused, I sat up, trying to figure out what was going on. Then, out of nowhere, I felt something poke my foot. My heart jumped, and I screamed. At the foot of my bed stood Ethan. He raised his hands like he was trying to calm me down and said, "Shoo, it's just me." I was too stunned to speak. He quickly explained, "My parents were fighting, and I didn't know where to go, so I came here. I just want to sleep here tonight." I could not believe what I was hearing. He had climbed through my window in the middle of the night. I told him to get out immediately. He started pleading, saying he just needed a place to sleep. "Please, just let me stay," he begged. But I was firm. "Get out," I repeated. Watching him turn and climb back out of my window was one of the creepiest things I had ever seen. As soon as he was gone, I slammed the window shut, locked it tight, and ran straight to my parents' room. I shook them awake and told them everything. They were just as shocked as I was. The next morning, both my mom and dad walked down the block to confront Ethan's parents. When they came back, they looked frustrated and defeated. They told me that Ethan's mom had completely lost it during the conversation. She screamed at them, laughed in their faces, and refused to take any responsibility for what happened. My parents decided not to get the police involved, probably because Ethan was just a kid. But a few nights later, I woke up again, this time to knocking at my window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. My blinds were closed, but I knew it was him. The knocking was persistent, going on and on for several minutes. At one point, I even heard the sound of the window being tugged, like he was trying to open it. I was terrified. My mind raced with questions. What was he planning to do? Eventually, the knocking stopped. I told my parents about it the next morning, but they just told me to ignore him and reassured me he was harmless because he was still just a kid. A few days later, I was riding bikes with Jake and another friend I had made at school. As we passed Ethan's house, I noticed him in the window. He was staring at us, his face pressed against the glass like he had been waiting there for me. It gave me chills. I told my friends about everything that had happened, and they found the whole situation both disturbing and oddly funny. One of them joked, "He sounds exactly like the kind of guy who would live in a house like that." That night, I woke up to the sound of glass shattering. I bolted upright and saw Ethan climbing through my window, pushing his way in through the broken glass and blinds. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran straight to my parents' room. By the time I had woken them up, Ethan was already gone. My dad stormed outside in his pajamas and chased him all the way back to his house. Ethan managed to slip inside before my dad could catch him, but that did not stop my dad. He pounded on their front door until Ethan's parents came out. I could hear their voices all the way from my bedroom. Whatever my dad said to them must have worked. By the end of the conversation, Ethan's parents agreed to pay for the broken window as long as my dad did not call the police. They paid for the repairs, and after that, I never saw or heard from Ethan again. Well, almost never. I spotted him a couple of times over the next few years, standing outside his house while we drove by in the car. Eventually, his family moved away, and I cannot say I was sorry to see them go. Even now, I sometimes wonder what Ethan's intentions were that night. Was he planning to hurt me? Was it revenge because he saw me hanging out with other kids? I do not know, and honestly, I do not want to know. The whole thing still gives me chills. I can only imagine what kind of person Ethan grew up to be, and it is not a comforting thought.